My colleague Kristen Sparding and I, who come from the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, are here in Berlin primarily for a two-day conference that ended yesterday, sponsored by the government of Germany, with the goal of focusing on ways we can all work together, governments, civil society, trade unions, and business, to promote more sustainable global supply chains. By that, what we all mean is particularly focusing on ways in the wake of incidents such as the terrible tragedy, the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh almost 2 years ago, April 24th, 2013. How can all of us work together to avoid repetitions of those kind of terrible accidents by committing ourselves to ensure that supply chains globally are more sustainable, including with respect to strong labor standards throughout those supply chains? The Department of Labor is a very large department, nearly 17,000 employees, and most of those employees do very important work within the United States on critical issues such as occupational safety and health, wage and hour issues, mine safety, labor statistics, employment security, and so forth. Within that very large department, we have a small, roughly 115 people, Bureau of International Labor Affairs. And what we exist for, and we've existed for more than half a century, is to complement the work of the rest of the department and focus on how our work internationally can address the issues of worker rights and workplace safety around the world by raising and strengthening international labor standards. So the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or ILAB for short, focuses on a number of different things, addressing very challenging issues of child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking, strengthening the linkages between trade and labor through trade agreements and other programs, and working in our leadership role at the International Labor Organization in Geneva to enhance global respect and adherence to internationally recognized labor standards covering issues such as child labor and forced labor, freedom of association, the right to bargain collectively, and working conditions, safety and health conditions. Most of the work we do at the International Labor Affairs Bureau is working with other governments around the world. So traditionally, the focus of our attention, pursuant to our mandate and consistent with what Congress has looked for us to do, has been to engage with other governments, whether they happen to be in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, or elsewhere, and work on joint initiatives to strengthen adherence and respect for labor rights, worker rights, and workplace safety. That has included reporting, project funding, technical cooperation, other forms of assistance. But we've learned over the years that that's only part of the solution to these challenging problems. It's also important to focus on the role and responsibilities of the private sector, and that's where supply chains come in. Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, circumstances of the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa sector in West Africa, workplace conditions in places like Colombia and Haiti and so forth, all reflect the fact that in order to have a comprehensive approach to these issues, you've got to address both the lead role and responsibilities of governments, but also the role that business, civil society, trade unions, and others can play. And supply chains are nothing more than a way to say that in order to get to the root cause of how to improve working conditions and strengthen the voice of workers, whether it's at the factory level or in agricultural production or in mines or whatever, you have to work with all the actors along the supply chain, including ultimately the buyers, the retailers, and the others who ultimately purchase the goods that come from these places. A lot of the challenges go to defining and clarifying the respective roles that both government and non-governmental actors can play. So to give a couple of examples, in the case of Bangladesh, which has gotten a huge amount of attention in the last 2 years since the terrible building collapse and a fire that preceded it, it's clear that in the case of Bangladesh and in other countries around the world, including in the United States, the paramount role, and this has been recognized by bodies such as the United Nations and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development through mechanisms such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines on Multinational Enterprises. The paramount responsibility has to rest with governments. It's their, as the UN guidelines say, it's their duty to protect human rights, including labor rights. So we have to do what we can to work with governments to strengthen, for example, their labor inspectorates, to make sure that they have the capacity, they have the ability to go into workplaces, to go to farms, to go to other enterprises, to ensure that they're safe and enhance not only productivity and competitiveness, but enhance the lives of the workers who are employed there. But in addition to that, it's critical that we understand that beyond the role of government, there is a role for the private sector. So, for example, under the UN Guiding Principles, a second pillar of those guiding principles defines and lays out the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And that's in some ways where we begin our analysis and our thinking about supply chains. Because just as the government of Bangladesh or the government of Haiti or the government of Honduras or the government of Cote d'Ivoire has the lead responsibility, it's critical that businesses and others play a role as well, because after all, they're the ones who ultimately purchase the goods from these entities, whether it's a farm, whether it's a factory. And so they have their own roles and responsibilities that are being defined with increasing clarity under international instruments. And so the challenge is to figure out what you do to strengthen the role of government to do a better job, and what do you do to ensure that there's also a critical role for business and others, ultimately in enhancing the ability of workers to have their own strong voice in advocating for their own safety, for their own beneficial workplace existence.